Our scripture reading today is from the 12th chapter of Genesis, verses 1 through 9. It's the part of the story of Abraham and Sarah. You may remember that they were named Abraham and Sarah at some point during their story by God. Before that, their names are Abram and Sarai, and so that's what you're going to hear today, unless I slip up and use the more familiar names at some point instead, which could happen. The other thing that I just want to share as background is that you may remember Abram grew up in the land of Ur. He moved along with his family from there to Haran partway through his life, and the story here picks up then when Abram hears the call from God. Originally, Abram's whole family was going to go to Canaan, and they stopped. They didn't make it all the way there, so they stopped at Haran, not too far away actually from Ur, and then they just settled down, and that's where they stayed until Abram heard from God. So from the 12th chapter of Genesis, verses 1 through 9, the Lord said to Abram, "Leave your land, your family, and your father's household, for the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation and will bless you. I will make your name respected, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I will curse. All the families of the earth will be blessed because of you." Abram left just as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all of their possessions, and those who became members of their household in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And when they arrived in Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as the sacred place at Shechem, at the oak of Moreh. The Canaanites lived in the land at that time. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "I give this land to your descendants." So Abram built an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. From there he traveled toward the mountains east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and worshipped in the Lord's name. Then Abram set out toward the arid southern plain, making and breaking camp as he went. And the story of Abram and Sarai continues. They travel more, they wander, but Canaan is where they settle. There's a fascinating new video game that's out. I think it came out in June. It's called No Man's Sky. I don't know if any of you have heard of it or have explored it at all. It's a game that is created by somebody who, I don't understand how this stuff is even possible, but the computers have generated 18 quintillion planets that's 18 with 18 zeros after it, that are fully explorable with all kinds of different species of animals, different kinds of flora, different kinds of terrain, different temperatures. There's cold planets, there's hot planets, and everything in between. And so you can explore all of these planets. It's an online game. And so you're playing the game at the same time as thousands of other people. But here's the thing. You start the game on a planet, and nobody else starts on that planet. And everybody else has started on their own planet. In this galaxy of 18 quintillion planets, the creator says that probably 90% of the planets that the game has created, nobody will ever step foot on. But it's possible that they will, so they're all created. And chances are, you will never encounter another player as long as you play the game. Now, like in the first week, 2 people actually did encounter each other. But most people will play the game and never encounter another person. What a weird thing. It falls into the category of game called a massive multiplayer game. So massive multiplayer. There's thousands of people playing the game at the same time. They're all playing the game at the same time. And they will probably never encounter each other. It's an entirely different conception, because normally in a massive multiplayer game, you want to encounter each other. And so the early reviews of the game are kind of mixed. Some people have said that it's fantastic. Other people have said it's bizarre and kind of eerie. One review that I read said it's just a really eerie feeling to know that there's these thousands of people out there playing the same game that you're playing, and you never have any interaction with any of them. It's very lonely, was that person's experience. Now, of course, even in families, from time to time, it's good to have some alone time, right? Sometimes you have to have your own space. But I think the reason why that game for some folks has come across as so eerie is because even those of us who are introverts, we know innately within us that we're made for community. We're made for each other. Now, this is one of the pieces of the doctrine of the Trinity, by the way, that's just an amazing piece. God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the triune God, three in one, that God in God's self is community. And we as people made in the image of God, we are made for community. We're made for community with God. We're made for community with one another. We need to have community. We need to be together. And so Abram and Sarai left their home with Lot and a few other folks, and of course, with God. They were not entirely alone, but they became nomads for years until they finally made their way to Canaan. A distance that they traveled was about the same as from Kansas City to Florida when they finally settled in Canaan. Now, by modern definitions, Abram and Sarai were not refugees. They were immigrants. A refugee is somebody who leaves a country out of fear for their safety, maybe out of fear for safety because of a natural disaster, or maybe because of a military coup, or whatever it might be. But for some reason or another, they leave their country because they're afraid for their safety. An immigrant, on the other hand, is somebody who just leaves their country for any old reason. And so there's a difference between the two. So by that definition, Abram and Sarai would be immigrants. They didn't have to leave where they were. They just chose to leave where they were. But nevertheless, anytime an immigrant or a refugee leaves the country where they're from, they take a big risk coming to a place that they're not familiar with. I want to show you a short clip. This happens to be about a refugee. This is about a woman who is settled in Fargo in North Dakota. And I want you to see briefly some of the possibilities for what can happen for somebody who's a refugee who comes from another culture, another country, another experience, and comes here to the United States. In this case, comes to Fargo.
I came to United States in 1998, and it was very exciting to have the opportunity to start over my life and to have a second chance at life. Since we came, we considered this place our new home. We wanted to integrate right away and be contributing members of this community from day one. We started working right away and paying taxes like everyone else.
Okay, so my experience prior to meeting Leticia regarding refugees was very limited. I didn't really understand maybe all there is to know and how many changes a refugee needs to go through, the resiliency it takes to be a refugee. She really helped educate me. She really helped open my eyes and soften my heart, and she made all the difference for me. Leticia, she wants to be active in the community, and she is. She serves on different boards. She's able to give all of this knowledge and resources back to the community. She has a quality of leadership about her. She has so much to contribute. And I was fascinated with her from the beginning. I wanted to know her story. I wanted to know what made her so resilient. Why was she looking for a way to let her light shine, even though she had been through some trauma?
Part of Leticia's story as a refugee, and You can tell the difference that she's made. Not only has being in that community made a difference for her, but she's made a difference for that community. And that's precisely what we would hope would be the case for every refugee, for every immigrant who comes to the Kansas City area. One of the things that we're doing at St. Paul's is to work with Catholic Charities. And some of you were downstairs at 9:30 this morning to learn more about the work that Catholic Charities is doing and that we're going to be doing with Catholic Charities on welcoming refugees here into the Kansas City area. We're the first church that's, as a church, said that we're going to be able to do that, and so I'm thrilled with that, and thrilled with the opportunity that we have to be able to make a difference in the lives of refugees, partially for their sake, and partially because they also then will have a chance to make a difference in this community, and just like was the case for Leticia. Abram and Sarai, when they came to Canaan, they did even better for themselves than Leticia's doing in Fargo. We're told in the 13th chapter of Genesis that they became very wealthy. They had land, they had flocks, they were just doing fantastic. And we want to encourage that. We want to encourage people and help people to do well for themselves as they come here to Kansas City. And I also want to think about what it means to be an immigrant or a refugee. I want to use that as a metaphor to think about us who are here at St. Paul's. So follow with me for a minute. There's a few of you, not very many, but there's a few of you for whom this would not apply. If you were raised here at the church, if this is the place where you were born into, then that wouldn't be the case for you. But for everybody else, in a way, you are a church immigrant or refugee. It might be that you're a refugee having come here from another church experience that for you had become a really painful and bad experience. It could be that for your own spiritual safety you came here to St. Paul's, that you had an experience with a theology that was hurtful to you, or that you came from a church that had practices that were hurtful to you, and you came to St. Paul's in part as in a sense, a spiritual refugee. Do you hear that? I know that that's true for some of you. And if that's not the case for you, then probably you're here as a kind of an immigrant from another place, perhaps from another church, perhaps from another United Methodist church or another church that you had moved to Kansas City or to this part of Kansas City from another area, and as you moved physically in your location, you thought, now I need to find a new church, and so you've immigrated from one church to this church. Or for some of you, you didn't have a church that you were part of to begin with. We had, last week, we baptized a family of 4. 2 weeks before that, we baptized a family of 3. People who did not have a church experience, or at least had not had a church experience for many, many years. And so that might be the case for you. Maybe this is the first church that you have been a part of in your life or in a very, very long time, and so you've immigrated from another Sunday morning experience to the Sunday morning experience of being here at a church. And regardless of what the specifics are for you, we know that statistically, more than 80% of people who come to a church for the first time, whatever that church might be, come at a point of great life transition. It may be moving to a new home or to a new city. It may be a job change. It may be a new family situation, a new birth, or a new or upcoming wedding, or it could be a death in the family, or a significant illness in the family. We know, though, that more than 80% of people who come to a church for the first time come at the time that they're experiencing a great transition of some kind. And so those transitions that we have in life are points that are especially stressful for us. And at those stressful points, we often will come to a new church, which in itself can be stressful too. I would invite you to think for a moment of what it was like for you when you first walked through the doors of St. Paul's. There's some folks here who you didn't walk through these doors for the first time. You walked through the doors at Mill Creek Elementary for the first time, back when St. Paul's was worshiping at the school years ago. But what was it like for you when you first did that? I remember for myself, not walking into St. Paul's for the first time, but I remember having a week of vacation, and I came to the church that my parents are members of, which is a church that I was in from 5th grade through the end of high school. I remember walking into that church. This was a couple of years ago, and boy, it was kind of intimidating for me to walk into that place. And part of it is because I knew that there'd be a few people there who would remember me sort of, but not really, and what would they remember of me, or what would they think of me? Part of it, and maybe you can resonate with this, part of it is that when you walk into a church for the first time, you don't know, even if you've seen it on the web page, you don't know exactly what the people are going to be like. You don't know exactly what they're going to be wearing. You don't know what the music's going to be like, or what the liturgy would be like. You don't know what the sermon's going to be like. You don't know, you just don't know what you're walking into. And are the people who you meet there, are they going to be friendly to you, or are they going to be off-putting, or are they going to be too friendly? Like, really, I have to go, I have dinner plans, and it's 5 o'clock now, and you've kept me here for 5 hours talking to me, which is very nice, but I'm tired, and I want to go home and sleep. Is the church going to be too friendly? Because that happens sometimes. We got one note back for first-time visitors. We invite them to give us some feedback, and that's some feedback that we got a few weeks ago, that they were greeted a little bit too vigorously. So that's a real thing too. It's a scary experience. For many of us, it's a scary experience to walk into a church for the first time. And for whatever reason, you did that with St. Paul's. And I'm so glad that for whatever reason, you chose to walk into the doors at St. Paul's for the first time. Many of you have done that over the past 10 years or so. We've grown as a church. Our membership has grown from about 500 to over 750 over the last 10 years. And so something good is happening here, that people are willing to put down a stake here and say, this is where I belong. But I want to acknowledge how hard it is to walk into that door for the first time. And here's what I want to do this morning. I want to invite you to think for yourself about what it was like when you did walk through the doors for the first time. Think for a minute about what was going through your mind. Think for a minute about what you experienced. Think for a minute about what it was that made you feel like this is a place that I could see myself coming back to again. Think about what may have happened that made you say, this is a place where maybe I could come back to, but I'm not so sure. Think about the ways that the things that were helpful for you, but also think about the things that were not as helpful for you. And then I want you to know that almost every single Sunday, we have at least one person who comes into this church for the first time. Almost every single Sunday, we have at least one person who walks into the church for the first time. And that person is probably having a fairly similar experience to the experience that you had when you walked into the church for the first time. And I want you to think for a minute about what you might be able to do to help that person who comes into the church for the first time to be able to make a home here at St. Paul's, just like you've made a home here at St. Paul's. How can we be appropriately welcoming and friendly and the place that would make them want to come back and have an experience here again? How can we be appropriately friendly in a way that makes them feel like they could make this be a home for them as a refugee or as an immigrant, somebody coming from another place to have an experience of faith here at St. Paul's? Now, the story of Abram and Sarai, of course, continues. Abraham and Sarah become their names. Generations go by. Eventually, their descendant Joseph and his brothers end up in Egypt. You remember how that story goes. They end up in Egypt because there's a great famine. They escape to Egypt and make a new home in Egypt as refugees. We have lots of refugees and lots of immigrants in the Bible. Jesus was a refugee, as his parents. He was the child of refugee parents who were fleeing, and the story of the Exodus is a story of refugees, right? Joseph and his brothers have settled in Egypt. Generations later, the Pharaoh of Egypt forgets about the circumstances and who these people are, and they forget about the great stuff that Joseph, as a refugee, had done for the people of Egypt, and the Hebrew people become slaves, and eventually under Moses' leadership they escape from Egypt, and under Joshua's leadership they come into Canaan, the same land that so many years earlier Abraham and Sarah had come into, and they settle again, and they experience again the wonders and the goodness of that land. For some of you, you've been a part of this church even before, and have gone away and have found your way back, and if that's your story, I'm so glad that you found your way back. We're going to talk more about that specifically here in a few weeks. There's another version of that story that we just shared. That's the biblical story. And there's some, I want to be clear, that piece of the Bible was not written to be history. That is written as a faith story. And there's some, if you read that literally, there's some historical issues that pop up, so that a purely literal reading becomes a little bit difficult to sustain. As a core story, I find great meaning in that story, and I find reliability in that story as a core story. Some scholars will take another point of view and will say, as they look at the story, as they look at the history, and as they look at the archaeology and so on and so forth, some scholars will say, there's actually a compelling reason to believe that that's not actually historically what happened, and that historically, they would say, historically what happened was that there was a variety of tribes that lived. Some of them came to Canaan from outside of the area, and others who were already in the area, not living in the cities of Canaan, but living in the surrounding area. And those different groups banded together and essentially, from different origins, became a nation, became the Israelite nation, and together then came in over the course of time to Canaan and took the land in that way. It's a very different story from the story that's recorded in the Bible, and there's some clues in the Bible that might be the case. Personally, understanding that there are some problems with treating the biblical story as pure history, I still find that to be a persuasive story. I'm not convinced by the scholars that the core of that biblical story is off base. But if it were, there's still kind of a compelling story of the idea of multiple groups coming together into one nation. In fact, really, that may not be the story of the Exodus, but that kind of is the story of Christ. And in fact, in the scripture today, you start to hear a little bit of this when God says to Abram, I give this land to your descendants. So Abram built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him, and then God goes on and says, I just lost it because I didn't have the verses numbered here. At the beginning, I will make your name respected. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I will curse. All the families of the earth will be blessed because of you. And later on in Abraham and Sarah's story, God makes a covenant with Abraham and says that all the nations will be blessed by Abraham, and it's a promise that comes that basically is reminding us of what's going to happen in Christ, that all the nations of the earth will be opened up for God. God's not going to be a God just for the people of the 12 tribes of Israel. God's going to be a God for all people, for all the nations. So in a way, it's a precursor of the story of what's going to happen for everybody under Christ. God makes space for everybody, not just for one group, not just for one nation. God makes room for every nation, for every person. And so may this church that we're a part of here be a church for every nation, for every person, for every refugee, for every immigrant, whether it's an immigrant or a refugee from another country who comes here, or whether it's an immigrant or a refugee from another church who comes here, or whether it's an immigrant or a refugee from the culture at large that needs to find a place for a faith who comes here. May this be a place where every person can find a home, can find a welcome, can find a family, and together we can worship God. That's who God calls us to be. I invite you to take a moment now, if you'd like to, and light a candle here in the front or back by the kitchen. And you can always choose to do that for whatever is meaningful for you at this moment, perhaps for in memory or in honor of a person. You might, and as I light a candle in a moment, what I'll do is to light that candle as a candle in honor of a person who I've not yet met, in honor of the refugee or the immigrant who has not yet come into the doors here at St. Paul's, but may as soon as next Sunday.